James Reeves never imagined he'd find himself in a standoff with his own neighborhood association, but as he stared at the massive delivery truck blocking his driveway that crisp autumn morning, he knew this was more than just a simple dispute. Overdues. As a retired structural engineer who had spent decades designing some of the city's most iconic buildings, he'd built his reputation on precision, integrity, and standing firm in his convictions. Now at 62, those same principles were about to be tested in ways he never expected. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. From the moment James and his wife Sarah had purchased their corner lot home in the prestigious Oak Valley subdivision 15 years ago, they'd transformed it into a showcase of thoughtful design and efficient living. The house itself was a masterpiece of modern architecture, with its clean lines and energy-efficient features, but it was the meticulously planned garden that truly set it apart. Every weekend, you'd find James tending to his prized collection of native plants and vegetables, a hobby that had turned into a passion project for teaching local kids about sustainable gardening. The Reeves home stood out in Oak Valley, not just for its unique design, but for the steady stream of young visitors who came for James's weekly gardening workshops. He'd started these classes 3 years ago after retiring from his firm, and they'd quickly become a neighborhood fixture. Parents appreciated how he combined practical gardening skills with basic engineering principles, helping their children understand everything from soil composition to water flow dynamics. What made James particularly proud wasn't just the garden itself, but what it represented. In a neighborhood increasingly focused on conformity and strict aesthetic guidelines, his property served as a living example of how functionality and beauty could coexist. The solar panels he'd installed were carefully integrated into the roof design, while the rainwater collection system doubled as an artistic water feature. Even his garden beds were built with reclaimed materials from his old construction projects, each one telling a story of sustainability and innovation. But not everyone appreciated James's vision. The newly elected board of the Oak Valley Homeowners Association had been pushing for increasingly stringent regulations about everything from paint colors to plant heights. James had watched with growing concern as neighbors received citations for the most minor deviations from these new standards. Yet he'd always assumed his property was protected by the grandfather clause in the original HOA agreement, which specifically exempted existing structures and landscaping from future modifications to the guidelines. Sarah, ever the voice of reason, had noticed the tension building. "They're not going to stop with just sending letters, James," she'd warned him last week after their third notice about unauthorized educational activities arrived in the mail. "The new board is different from the old one. They don't care about community spirit anymore. It's all about property values and perfect lawns now." James had dismissed her concerns initially, confident that his detailed documentation and perfect understanding of the HOA bylaws would protect them. After all, he'd helped draft some of the original guidelines back when the community was first established. His workshops were properly permitted, his modifications all carefully documented, and his dues, well, those were paid religiously, always on time, always in full, or so he thought. As he stood in his kitchen that morning, sipping his coffee and reviewing the plans for that day's workshop about winter vegetable planting, James had no idea that his peaceful routine was about to be shattered. He couldn't have known that the apparently simple clerical error he'd discover in his bank statements would spiral into a confrontation that would test not just his resolve, but the very fabric of the community he'd helped build. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across his drafting table where the workshop plans lay spread out. In just a few hours, A dozen eager young gardeners would arrive, ready to learn about cold frames and soil preparation. At least that was what was supposed to happen. But fate and the Oak Valley HOA had other plans entirely. The first sign that something was amiss came when James noticed an unusual number of cars slowly driving past his house during his morning inspection of the garden beds. In Oak Valley, where everyone knew everyone else's routines, any deviation from the norm stood out. He recognized Bradley Thompson's silver Mercedes among them, the newly elected HOA president, who had made no secret of his disdain for what he called James's community garden experiment. Sarah joined him outside, wrapped in her morning robe and carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She handed one to James, her expression concerned as another unfamiliar vehicle crawled past their property. "Something's not right," she murmured, watching as the car's occupants openly stared at their house. "Have you checked your email this morning?" James hadn't. He'd been too focused on preparing for the day's workshop. Pulling out his phone, he found his inbox flooded with messages from the HOA board. The most recent, marked urgent and sent at 6:45 a.m., made his blood run cold. Final notice, immediate cessation of unauthorized activities and payment of outstanding dues required. "Outstanding dues?" James muttered, opening the attachment. According to the HOA's records, he had missed 6 months of payments, totaling over $3,000 with late fees. "This is ridiculous," he said, showing Sarah the screen. "I have automatic payments set up. I haven't missed a single month since we moved in." Sarah frowned, pulling up their joint banking account on her own phone. After a few minutes of scrolling, her face paled. "James, the payments stopped going through in April. Look." She showed him the transaction history where the familiar monthly deduction from the HOA had indeed vanished. "But we never received any notifications about failed payments." Because they were sending them to the wrong address, James realized, scanning through the HOA's email. "They've been using our old email from when we first moved in, the one we haven't used in years, the same one that was supposed to have been updated in their system last January." The sound of an engine, louder and more aggressive than the passenger cars from earlier, drew their attention to the street. A large white van had stopped at the end of their driveway, its hazard lights flashing. The driver, a young man in a crisp polo shirt with the HOA logo, stepped out carrying a stack of papers. "Mr. and Mrs. Reeves," he called out, approaching them with what seemed like rehearsed confidence. "I have some documents that require your immediate attention." He held out a thick envelope, his professional smile never reaching his eyes. "The board has asked me to inform you that you have 1 hour to begin removing all non-approved structures from your property, including but not limited to the raised garden beds, water collection system, and any educational materials." James took the envelope, his engineer's hand steady despite his rising anger. "On what grounds?" Section 7.3 of the updated bylaws clearly states that all external structures must be approved by the current board, the young man recited, as if reading from a script. "Your grandfather clause was contingent on maintaining good standing with the association. According to our records, you've been in default since April." Sarah stepped forward, her usual calm demeanor showing cracks. "This is clearly a mistake. We can resolve the payment issue immediately, but you can't seriously expect us to dismantle everything we've built here." The young man's smile turned, apologetic, but his eyes remained cold. "I'm just the messenger, Mrs. Reeves. The board's decision is final. They've also asked me to remind you that today's planned activities are in violation of the neighborhood's residential use-only policies. Any gathering of more than 3 non-resident individuals requires explicit board approval." James felt the weight of every word hitting him like physical blows. The workshops, his gardens, the sustainable systems he'd spent years perfecting, everything he'd built was being threatened because of what had to be a simple banking error. But something about this felt too coordinated, too precise to be just about missed payments. As if reading his thoughts, the young man added, "Mr. Thompson wanted me to personally assure you that if you comply promptly with all requirements, the board would be willing to work out a reasonable payment plan for your outstanding dues." He paused, checking his watch. "You have 57 minutes remaining before we're authorized to take further action." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Further action?" Sarah asked, her voice sharp. The young man's smile finally disappeared. "The board has contracted with a local service to ensure compliance. They're very thorough." With that, he turned and walked back to his van, leaving James and Sarah standing in their carefully tended garden, holding an envelope full of threats disguised as legal documents. As they watched the van drive away, James's phone buzzed with a text from Emily Chen, one of his regular workshop participants' mothers. "Just got an email from the HOA. Is it true? They're shutting down the garden program. My daughter will be heartbroken." More messages started flowing in, each one expressing disbelief and concern. The community James had built, the children he'd taught, the neighbors who had become friends. All of it was being threatened because of what he increasingly suspected was no accident at all. "They're trying to force us out," Sarah said quietly, reading the documents over his shoulder. "This isn't about dues or bylaws. They want our property." James nodded slowly, his mind already working through possibilities, analyzing angles like he would a complex structural problem. Bradley Thompson and his new board had picked the wrong engineer to intimidate. "Then they better be prepared for a fight," he said, turning toward the house. "I need to make some calls." The further action the young man had warned about arrived precisely 1 hour later, announcing itself with the deep rumble of a diesel engine. James, who had been on the phone with his bank trying to untangle the payment issue, looked up to see a massive flatbed truck maneuvering into position at the end of his driveway. Its size was deliberately intimidating, completely blocking not only his driveway, but part of the sidewalk as well. 2 men emerged from the truck's cab. The driver, a weathered-looking man in his 50s with a neatly trimmed salt and pepper beard, took up position leaning against the hood, absently flipping through his phone. The passenger, younger and wearing a pristine, high-visibility vest that looked like it had never seen a day of real work, strode purposefully toward the house. "James Reeves," the younger man called out, waving a tablet. "I'm Kevin Walsh from Apex Community Compliance Services. We've been authorized by the Oak Valley HOA to ensure enforcement of their recently updated regulations." His tone was professional, almost apologetic, but his body language suggested he was prepared for confrontation. James stepped onto his porch, maintaining the higher ground both literally and figuratively. "You mean you've been hired to block my driveway?" "Sir, we're simply here to motivate compliance with association guidelines," Kevin replied, glancing at his tablet. "According to our work order, you were given notice to begin removing unauthorized structures. Since no action has been observed, we're implementing standard enforcement procedures." Sarah appeared beside James, holding a stack of printouts from their bank. "We have proof here that there's been a technical error with the payments. If you'll just look." "Ma'am, I sympathize, but we're not authorized to review financial disputes," Kevin interrupted, his rehearsed patience wearing thin. "Our role is simply to remain in position until we receive confirmation from the board that all compliance issues have been resolved." James felt his engineering mind kick into high gear, analyzing the situation like a complex structural problem. "And what about the dozen kids and their parents who are supposed to be here in less than an hour for their gardening workshop? Are you planning to block them too?" Kevin's professional mask slipped slightly. "Sir, any unauthorized gatherings would be in direct violation of current HOA guidelines. If participants attempt to access the property, we're instructed to document their presence for potential future legal action." Legal action. Sarah's voice rose with disbelief. Against children learning about gardening? Against anyone participating in unauthorized commercial activities in a residential zone, Kevin corrected, reading directly from his tablet. The board has been quite clear about this. James was about to respond when movement caught his eye. Bradley Thompson's Mercedes was making another slow pass by the house, the HOA president clearly visible behind the wheel, watching the scene unfold with poorly concealed satisfaction. "This is harassment," James stated firmly, his voice carrying across the lawn. "You're blocking access to private property based on a payment dispute that we can prove is an error." The older driver finally looked up from his phone. "Look, buddy, we're just doing our job. You want this truck moved? Talk to the board. Until then, we're not going anywhere." As if to emphasize his point, the driver reached back into the cab and killed the engine, dropping a set of keys into his pocket with deliberate showmanship. The message was clear. They were settling in for the long haul. James felt his phone, buzzing in his pocket, likely more messages from worried parents asking about the workshop. He had 15 minutes to figure out a solution before families started arriving. Sarah squeezed his arm gently, a gesture that had always meant, "I trust your judgment," throughout their decades together. Taking a deep breath, James made a decision. He turned to Kevin, his voice steady and controlled. "I'm going to give you one chance to move that truck voluntarily. After that, I'll be forced to take action that will make both your company and the HOA board very uncomfortable." Kevin's professional demeanor cracked further, revealing a flash of uncertainty. "Sir, are you threatening us?" "Not at all," James replied calmly. "I'm simply informing you that I'm about to exercise my rights as a property owner. What happens next is entirely your choice." The older driver barked out a laugh. "Rights? Check your HOA agreement, old man. Your rights are whatever the board says they are." James allowed himself a small smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Actually, I helped write the original HOA agreement for Oak Valley, and I can assure you nothing in it gives you the authority to do this." He paused, letting that sink in. "But more importantly, I spent 30 years as a structural engineer. Would you like me to explain exactly why your current parking position violates City Code 47.3 regarding emergency access routes?" The confidence in Kevin's expression wavered. "We have authorization from the board." "The board can't authorize you to break city law," James interrupted. "That truck is blocking emergency vehicle access to not just my property, but the entire cul-de-sac behind us. One phone call to the fire marshal's office, and you'll both be facing civil penalties that would make these HOA dues look like pocket change." The older driver straightened up, no longer looking quite so relaxed. "You're bluffing." "Try me," James replied, already dialing a number on his phone. "I still have some good friends in the city planning office. Should I ask them to explain it to you?" The standoff stretched for several long moments, broken only by the sound of approaching cars, the first of the workshop families arriving. James held Kevin's gaze steadily, phone raised to his ear, while Sarah began waving to the confused parents now stopping along the street. Finally, Kevin's professional facade crumbled completely. "Start it up," he called to his partner. "This isn't worth the hassle." The truck roared to life, but as it began to move, James caught sight of Bradley Thompson's Mercedes making another pass. The HOA president's face was twisted with fury as he watched his intimidation tactics crumble. This wasn't over, it was just beginning. As the truck rumbled away, James watched Bradley Thompson's Mercedes make one final pass before speeding off, tires squealing slightly against the pavement. The immediate threat was gone, but James knew better than to consider this a victory. 30 years of engineering had taught him that when one support fails, you need to check the entire structure. Sarah was already directing arriving parents to park along the street, explaining the situation in her calm, measured way. The kids, oblivious to the tension, were gathering around the garden beds with their usual enthusiasm. James checked his phone, 3 missed calls from their bank's fraud department, and a new email from the HOA board marked urgent violation of cease and desist, Mr. Reeves. A gentle voice drew his attention. Emily Chen, one of the most active parents in the workshop program, stood at the foot of his porch steps. Unlike the other parents who had arrived with their children, she was alone and carrying a thick manila envelope. "Do you have a moment? I think there's something you need to see." James nodded, leading her inside to his home office while Sarah began the workshop outside. Emily, he remembered, worked as a paralegal at one of the city's largest real estate firms. As she spread documents across his desk, her usual friendly demeanor was replaced by professional focus. "I wasn't sure at first," she began, arranging papers in a specific order, "but after getting that email about the workshops being unauthorized, I decided to do some digging. Look at these." She pointed to what appeared to be property records. "These are all recent sales in Oak Valley, going back 18 months. Notice anything strange?" James leaned in, his engineer's eye for detail catching patterns in the data. Every property sold in the past year and a half had gone to one of 3 different corporate entities. Each entity had a different name, but as Emily showed him more documents, a pattern emerged. They all traced back to a single development company, Pinnacle Urban Development Group. "It gets more interesting," Emily continued, pulling out another document. "This is from a Public Planning Commission meeting. 3 months ago, Pinnacle submitted preliminary proposals for a luxury community redesign project. They were told they needed to control at least 75% of the properties in any existing neighborhood before proceeding." James felt his stomach tighten. "And how close are they in Oak Valley?" Emily's expression was grim. "With the latest purchases, they're at 72%. Your property, along with the Hendersons and the Patels, are the only remaining holdouts on this side of the neighborhood, and you're the only one with street access to the main road." The pieces began falling into place. The sudden change in HOA leadership, the aggressive new regulations, the targeting of his workshops. It wasn't just about dues or community guidelines. His property was the key to their entire development plan. "There's more," Emily said, lowering her voice despite being inside. "My firm doesn't handle Pinnacle's business directly, but we work with companies that do. There are rumors about their tactics in other neighborhoods. They typically start with bureaucratic pressure, HOA violations, fines, restrictions. When that doesn't work..." She trailed off, pulling up a news article on her phone. James read the headline, "Historic Neighborhood Residents Claim Harassment After Refusing Buyouts." The story detailed suspicious accidents, vandalism, and coordinated pressure from community organizations, all tied to properties that stood in the way of development projects. "Thank you for bringing this to me," James said, his mind already racing through implications and possible responses. "But why risk getting involved? Couldn't this cause problems for you?" Emily smiled sadly. "My daughter Lily learned to love science in your garden. She talks about becoming an environmental engineer now, all because you taught her about water systems and soil composition. Some things are worth fighting for." A knock at the office door interrupted them. Sarah stood there, her face tense. "James, you need to see this." She handed him her tablet, open to the neighborhood's private social media group. A new post from the HOA board was gathering comments rapidly. "Community alert, unauthorized commercial activity and safety concerns. The board has received multiple reports of dangerous conditions and unauthorized commercial activities at 1547 Oak Valley Drive. For the safety of our community, especially children, residents are advised to avoid this property until compliance issues can be resolved. The board cannot be held responsible for any accidents or injuries that may occur." "They're trying to scare parents away from the workshops," Sarah said quietly, "while laying groundwork for whatever comes next," Emily added, gathering her documents. "This is straight from their playbook. Create a paper trail of safety concerns before accidents start happening." James stood, moving to the window that overlooked his garden. Outside, a dozen kids were gathered around Sarah as she demonstrated proper seedling care. Each raised bed represented hours of careful planning, each irrigation line calculated for maximum efficiency. He'd built this place as a legacy, a way to pass on his knowledge and love for sustainable design. He wasn't about to let it be destroyed for luxury condos. "Emily," he said, turning back to his desk, "how would you feel about helping me with some more research? I think it's time we looked into Pinnacle's other projects and Bradley Thompson's connection to them." Emily's professional demeanor returned, along with a determined smile. "I thought you'd never ask. I already have some ideas about where to start." As they began planning their investigation, James could hear the excited voices of children from the garden. He had spent his career building things to last. Now he would need to use all that experience to protect not just his property, but the entire community he had helped create. James's prediction about escalation proved correct sooner than expected. As the workshop participants were leaving that afternoon, a city code enforcement vehicle pulled into his driveway. The inspector, a young woman with a clipboard and an apologetic expression, explained that they'd received an anonymous complaint about unauthorized structures and possible safety hazards. "I'll need to document everything," she said, gesturing to his garden setup. The report specifically mentioned concerns about the water collection system and raised beds. She glanced at her paperwork, frowning slightly. "Though I have to say, this is the third urgent complaint we've received about this property in the last 4 hours. That's unusual." James exchanged knowing looks with Sarah before addressing the inspector. "I'm a licensed structural engineer," he said, retrieving a thick binder from his office. "Every modification to this property has been properly documented and permitted. Here are all the relevant approvals, including the original designs and safety certifications." The inspector's eyes widened as she flipped through the meticulous documentation. "This is incredibly thorough. Most homeowners can barely find their original permits." "That's because most homeowners haven't spent 3 decades dealing with city planning departments," James replied, with a slight smile. "Would you like to see the recent structural integrity reports for the raised beds? Or perhaps the water quality testing results for the collection system?" For the next hour, James walked the inspector through every aspect of his property. He explained the engineering principles behind each design, the safety features built into every system, and the educational purpose each element served. By the time they finished, the inspector was taking notes for entirely different reasons. "Mr. Reeves," she said, closing her notebook, "I'm actually quite impressed. Would you mind if I brought some colleagues by next week? We've been looking for examples of sustainable residential design to help update our municipal guidelines." Before James could respond, a commotion from the street drew their attention. A large dump truck was backing up toward his property, its bed filled with what appeared to be construction debris. Bradley Thompson stood nearby, watching with poorly concealed satisfaction. "What's this?" the inspector asked, frowning at the scene. "This," James said grimly, "is what retaliation looks like." He pulled out his phone and began recording as the dump truck's bed slowly began to rise. The inspector straightened, her professional demeanor sharpening. "Sir!" she called out, striding toward the truck. "I'm with City Code Enforcement. You cannot dump materials here without proper permits and safety measures in place." The truck driver hesitated, looking toward Bradley for instruction. The HOA, President's smug expression faltered as he noticed the inspector's official vehicle in James's driveway. "There must be some mistake," Bradley said smoothly, stepping forward. "We're simply delivering materials for approved community improvements." "Really?" the inspector replied, pulling out her own phone. "I'd love to see the permits for that. And while we're at it, perhaps you could explain why these improvements involve dumping construction debris on a private property I just finished inspecting." Bradley's facade cracked slightly. "This is an HOA matter. This is a potential city code violation," the inspector corrected. "One that could result in significant fines if any dumping occurs without proper documentation and safety protocols." She turned to the truck driver. "I suggest you find an authorized disposal site for those materials." The driver didn't wait for Bradley's input this time. The truck bed lowered and the vehicle pulled away, leaving Bradley standing alone on the street. His face had reddened with barely contained rage. "This isn't over, Reeves," he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The board has other ways to handle problems like you." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Thompson?" James asked calmly, still recording. "In front of a city official." Bradley's mouth snapped shut. Without another word, he turned and stormed back to his Mercedes, pulling away with far more speed than was appropriate for a residential street. The inspector watched him go, then turned to James with a serious expression. "Mr. Reeves, I think you should know. Those other complaints I mentioned, they were all filed under different names, but they came from the same IP address. Someone's trying very hard to cause problems for you." "I know," James replied, still watching the direction Bradley had gone, "and I suspect this is just the beginning." Sarah joined them, carrying a printout of the HOA's social media post about their property. "They're already deleting comments from supporters and blocking anyone who questions their claims about safety issues." The inspector took a long look at the post, then pulled out her business card. "My name's Lisa Martinez," she said, handing it to James. "I've seen this kind of coordinated harassment before. If anything else happens, any more attempts at dumping, any suspicious activities, call me directly. The city takes these matters seriously." As Lisa left, James and Sarah stood in their driveway surveying their property. The garden beds were full of newly planted winter vegetables, the water collection system hummed efficiently, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across their carefully tended lawn. Everything they'd built was still standing, at least for now. "They're going to try something else," Sarah said quietly. James nodded, already composing a message to Emily about investigating those other pinnacle development projects. "Yes, they will, but next time we'll be ready." That night, James stayed up late in his office, poring over the documents Emily had provided. Sarah brought him coffee and a gentle reminder not to lose himself too deeply in the research. But she understood his need to prepare. Around midnight, his phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. "Check your security cameras." James pulled up the feed on his laptop and felt his heart skip. 3 figures in dark clothing were moving around his garden beds, their faces obscured by hooded sweatshirts. As he watched, one of them began pouring something from a large container into his main water collection tank. "Sarah!" he called out, already dialing 911 while pulling up Lisa Martinez's number on his other phone. His wife appeared in the doorway, took one look at the screen, and immediately began documenting everything with her tablet. The emergency dispatcher assured him police were on their way, but James knew timing would be crucial. He switched on the garden's floodlights using his phone app, illuminating the entire yard in harsh brightness. The figures scattered, dropping the container which rolled under one of the raised beds. Police arrived within minutes, lights flashing, but sirens silent. 2 officers swept the property, while a third took James's statement. They recovered the dropped container, an industrial-grade herbicide that would have destroyed not only his garden, but potentially contaminated the entire water collection system. This wasn't vandalism, James explained to the officers, pointing out how the perpetrators had specifically targeted the water tank. This was a calculated attempt to destroy an established educational program and create an environmental hazard. One of the officers examining the container nodded grimly. This is commercial-grade stuff. You can't just buy this at a garden center. Someone would need agricultural or industrial connections to get their hands on it. Lisa Martinez arrived. As they were finishing up the police report, having responded to James's late-night call. Despite the hour, she immediately began her own documentation, particularly focused on the potential environmental impact had the sabotage succeeded. "This changes things," she said, photographing the herbicide container. "Attempted contamination of a residential water system moves this beyond simple harassment. Environmental protection will need to be involved, and they take these cases very seriously." As the officials worked, James noticed movement at the edge of his property. Bradley Thompson stood in his driveway across the street watching the scene unfold in his robe and slippers. Even from a distance, James could see the man's expression shift from satisfaction to concern as he realized the level of official response. The next morning, while cleanup crews carefully tested and cleared his water system, James received an email from Emily. She'd done some late-night research of her own, triggered by his questions about Pinnacle's other projects. "You need to see this right away," she wrote. "Bradley Thompson isn't just working with Pinnacle. He's been involved in 3 other community renovations across the state. Each time, the pattern was the same. Take over the HOA, pressure holdouts, mysterious accidents, and, finally, forced sales. But here's the interesting part. In the Riverside Heights case last year, they used the same contractor for their enforcement activities, Apex Community Compliance Services. Attached were news articles, property records, and court documents, all painting a picture of systematic harassment and manipulation. But it was the last attachment that really caught James's attention, a photograph from a planning commission meeting 2 years ago, showing Bradley Thompson standing next to Kevin Walsh, the same man who had coordinated the truck blockade. "They're not just working together," James muttered, studying the image. "This is an organized operation." Zara, reading over his shoulder, pointed to another figure in the photograph's background. "Isn't that the man who tried to dump the construction debris yesterday?" James enlarged the image, confirming her observation. The pieces were falling into place, revealing a pattern of coordinated intimidation that went far beyond their neighborhood. His phone buzzed with a text from Lisa Martinez. "EPA investigators want to meet. This isn't just about your property anymore. How soon can you come to the city offices?" As James typed his response, another message came through. This one from the HOA board's official email. "Emergency meeting notice. Discussion of recent security concerns and property violations. Attendance mandatory." The timing wasn't a coincidence. They were scrambling to control the narrative before the EPA investigation could gain momentum. James forwarded both messages to Emily, adding a question. "How much documentation do you have on those other Pinnacle projects?" Her response was immediate. "Enough to show a pattern. Want me to bring it to the meeting?" James smiled grimly. Bradley Thompson and his associates had spent months building their pressure campaign, carefully documenting every supposed violation and safety concern. Now that same attention to detail would work against them, revealing the true nature of their operation. "Bring everything," he replied. "It's time to show the whole neighborhood exactly what they're really dealing with." The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. at the Oak Valley Community Center, but James arrived an hour early, Emily at his side with a rolling briefcase full of documents. They weren't surprised to find Bradley Thompson already there, huddled with several board members in intense discussion. What did surprise them was the number of neighbors who had also arrived early, filling the parking lot with quiet conversations and concerned looks. "Word's getting around," Emily murmured, nodding towards several clusters of residents. "That EPA involvement changed things. People are scared about what might have been done to their properties too. James recognized faces from his workshops, among the crowd, but also others he'd rarely spoken to. The Hendersons, one of the other holdout families, waved him over to where they stood with the Patels, the third family who had refused to sell. "Is it true?" David Henderson asked without preamble. "They tried to poison your water system?" Before James could respond, Bradley Thompson's voice cut through the growing murmur of conversation. "Everyone, please come inside. We're starting early to address these malicious rumors that have been circulating." The community center's main room had been arranged with chairs facing a long table where the board members sat, Bradley at the center. Behind them, a projector displayed a PowerPoint titled "Addressing Community Safety Concerns." Kevin Walsh, the man from Apex Compliance, stood off to the side, trying to look professional despite his obvious discomfort. "Thank you all for coming," Bradley began once everyone was seated. "We've called this emergency meeting to address some serious concerns about dangerous and unauthorized modifications to certain properties in our community. Recent events have highlighted the risks these violations pose." "You mean like dumping herbicides in someone's water supply?" The interruption came from Mrs. Patel, her voice sharp with accusation. "Or is that not the kind of risk you're concerned about?" Bradley's practiced smile tightened. "I understand there was an unfortunate incident last night, but let's not jump to conclusions. This is exactly why we need stronger oversight of unauthorized modifications. If proper protocols had been followed, I have documentation of every modification, permit, and safety inspection." James stood, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "The real question is why someone would try to contaminate a properly permitted and inspected system. Someone with access to industrial-grade herbicides and a vested interest in forcing certain residents out." "Mr. Reeves," Bradley's voice took on a warning tone, "these baseless accusations—" "Aren't baseless at all," Emily interrupted, standing beside James and opening her briefcase. "I have here documentation of similar incidents in 3 other communities where you were involved, Mr. Thompson. Communities that were subsequently demolished for pinnacle urban development projects." The room erupted in murmurs. Bradley's face flushed red as Emily began distributing copies of news articles and court documents to nearby residents. "This is slander," he snapped. "I won't stand for—" "Is it slander that you've been working with Pinnacle while serving as HOA president?" James asked, projecting his own laptop display onto the screen, replacing Bradley's PowerPoint with the Planning Commission photograph. "Is it slander that you've been coordinating with the same enforcement contractors across multiple communities?" Kevin Walsh started edging toward the door, but found his path blocked by several angry residents. "My firm has been tracking Pinnacle's activities," Emily added, her professional demeanor unwavering. "The pattern is clear. Take control of HOAs, create impossible compliance requirements, coordinate harassment of holdout properties, and force sales through manufactured safety violations. The EPA is already investigating the attempted contamination," James continued, "and I've been in contact with residents from other communities targeted by your operation. They're very interested in testifying about their experiences." Bradley stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This meeting is adjourned. Any further accusations will be handled by our attorneys." "Actually," a new voice called from the back of the room, "this meeting isn't over." Lisa Martinez stepped forward, accompanied by 2 men in suits who showed federal credentials. "We have some questions about environmental violations and coordinated property fraud." The room fell silent as the federal agents moved toward the board table. Bradley's face had gone from red to pale, his eyes darting between the agents and the door. "Furthermore," Lisa continued, "the city has concerns about potentially fraudulent permit applications submitted under this HOA's authority. We'll need to review all board communications regarding property modifications and enforcement actions." James watched as the carefully constructed facade of authority crumbled. Board members began distancing themselves from Bradley. Residents stepped forward with their own stories of harassment and pressure, and Kevin Walsh was already speaking quietly with one of the federal agents. The community center buzzed with activity as statements were taken and documents examined. Emily coordinated with other residents who had evidence to share, while Sarah arrived with additional copies of their documentation. The tide had turned, but James knew this was just the beginning. There would be investigations, likely lawsuits, and a long process of rebuilding trust in the neighborhood. But as he looked around at his neighbors, now openly sharing their experiences and supporting each other, he saw something else emerging. From the chaos, a real community, one built on mutual support rather than coercion and fear. "You did it," Sarah said quietly, taking his hand. James squeezed her hand gently. "We all did, and we're not done yet." The aftermath of the emergency meeting unfolded like a carefully orchestrated demolition, the kind James had overseen many times in his engineering career. One structural weakness exposed led to another, until the entire facade of Bradley Thompson's operation came crashing down. Within days, federal investigators had seized documents from both the HOA office and Bradley's home. Kevin Walsh, facing potential conspiracy charges, quickly turned on his former employers, providing detailed records of Pinnacle's community acquisition strategies. The evidence painted a damning picture of systematic harassment and fraud that stretched far beyond Oak Valley. James found himself at the center of a growing coalition of residents and victims from other communities targeted by Pinnacle. His engineering background proved invaluable as he helped document patterns of fraudulent safety violations and manipulated property assessments. Emily's legal expertise and connections helped coordinate their efforts with various investigative agencies. "They really picked the wrong person to target," Sarah commented one evening, watching James organize yet another binder of evidence. "They thought they were going after a retiring engineer with a garden hobby. Instead, they got someone who documents everything and understands exactly how to prove structural failures, both physical and organizational." Their kitchen had become an unofficial command center. The table was covered with papers, laptops, and cups of coffee as neighbors came and went, sharing information and working together to untangle years of manipulation. The Hendersons brought over old HOA communications showing how pressure had been gradually applied to various homeowners. The Patels contributed financial records revealing patterns of selective enforcement and arbitrary fines. One morning, about a week after the meeting, James received an unexpected visitor. Lisa Martinez arrived with a team from the city's planning department, including the director herself. "Mr. Reeves," the director began, surveying his garden with obvious interest, "we've been reviewing your property designs and educational program. In light of recent events, we're particularly interested in your approach to sustainable residential development. Would you be willing to consult with us on updating our municipal guidelines?" It was a surprising turn of events, but one that made perfect sense. While Bradley and his associates had been trying to tear down the community, James had been building something sustainable, both literally and figuratively. "I'd be happy to help," he replied, "but on one condition: this needs to be a collaborative effort. There are a lot of people in this community with valuable insights and expertise." The director smiled. "That's exactly what we were hoping to hear. We're not just interested in the technical aspects. We want to understand how to foster genuine community engagement and sustainable development practices." As they walked through his garden, discussing possible initiatives, James noticed more neighbors gathering. Word had spread quickly about the city's interest, and people were eager to contribute their own ideas and experiences. Mrs. Chen, a retired landscape architect, offered insights about incorporating native plants into municipal guidelines. The Hendersons, who ran a small technology consulting firm, suggested ways to integrate smart monitoring systems into community water management. Even teenagers from James's workshops chimed in with surprisingly sophisticated observations about sustainable design. This is what a real community looks like, Sarah observed, watching the impromptu planning session unfold in their backyard. Not something imposed from above, but built from the ground up, with everyone contributing their strengths. The contrast with Bradley Thompson's vision couldn't have been starker. Where he had sought to control and conform, this organic collaboration was creating something far more valuable and sustainable. Later that afternoon, Emily arrived with more updates from the ongoing investigation. Bradley Thompson had been arrested while attempting to shred documents at the Pinnacle offices. The company's other development projects were under scrutiny, and more communities were coming forward with similar stories. The prosecutor wants to meet with you next week, Emily said, spreading new documents across the kitchen table. They're building a RICO case against Pinnacle and their associates. Your documentation is going to be crucial, especially the patterns you identified in their enforcement tactics. James nodded, examining the latest evidence. What about the other communities, the ones they already managed to take over? That's actually why I'm here, Emily replied, pulling out a specific folder. The authorities are looking at ways to reverse some of the fraudulent acquisitions. They're particularly interested in your ideas about sustainable community development. They think it might provide a framework for rebuilding these neighborhoods. The implications were significant. What had started as a defense of his own property had evolved into something much larger, a potential model for protecting and revitalizing communities against predatory development. We'll need to be thorough, James said, already reaching for his design notebooks. If we're going to help other neighborhoods recover, we need to document everything. Not just what went wrong, but how to build something better. Sarah watched her husband with a knowing smile. This was the James she knew, the engineer who saw beyond immediate problems to underlying solutions, who built things to last. The garden workshops would continue, but now they were part of something bigger, a blueprint for genuine community development. Should I start another pot of coffee? She asked, already knowing the answer. There would be many long nights ahead, but this time they weren't working to defend against destruction. They were building something new. Over the next few weeks, Oak Valley transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The investigation into Pinnacle's activities had opened floodgates of community engagement and cooperation. What Bradley Thompson had tried to suppress through intimidation and control was now flourishing in an atmosphere of shared purpose and mutual support. James found himself busier than ever, but in ways that energized rather than exhausted him. His garden workshops had expanded, now incorporating elements of civil engineering and community planning. Adults joined the children's sessions, eager to understand how sustainable design principles could protect and enhance their properties. It's not just about growing vegetables anymore, he explained to a packed workshop one Saturday morning. It's about understanding how our individual choices affect the entire community. Every water management system, every native plant garden, every solar panel installation, they're all part of a larger ecosystem. Sarah had taken charge of coordinating the growing network of neighborhood initiatives. Their living room whiteboard, once filled with investigation notes and legal strategies, now tracked community projects and volunteer schedules. The Patels had started a composting program. The Hendersons were developing a neighborhood emergency response plan, and Mrs. Chen was leading a native plant exchange. One morning, as James was demonstrating soil composition testing to a group of eager students, a familiar truck pulled up to his driveway. His heart skipped a beat until he recognized the driver. It was the older man who had been with Kevin Walsh during the attempted blockade. "Mr. Reeves!" the man called out, stepping down from the cab. He looked different now, less confrontational, more uncertain. "Got a minute? I owe you an apology." James excused himself from the workshop and met the man at the edge of his property. Up close, he could see the wear of recent weeks in the driver's face. "Name's Mike Donovan," the man said, extending his hand. "I've been doing HOA enforcement work for 20 years, but I never—" He trailed off, looking around at the thriving garden and engaged community members. "I never really thought about what we were destroying." Mike explained that after Kevin Walsh's confession, he'd started examining his own role in Pinnacle's schemes. He'd visited other communities they'd targeted, seen the aftermath of their enforcement actions. Now he wanted to make amends. "I've got records," he said, gesturing to a file box in his truck. "Dates, locations, names of everyone involved in similar operations across 3 states. The feds already have most of it, but I thought you should see it too. Might help with those community protection guidelines you're working on." James studied the man for a moment before nodding. "Come inside. I think there are some people who'd be interested in hearing what you have to say." In James's kitchen, Mike laid out years of documented abuse, manufactured violations, coordinated harassment campaigns, strategic property devaluation. But more importantly, he provided insight into how communities could protect themselves. "They always start the same way," Mike explained to James, Sarah, Emily, and Lisa Martinez, who'd been called in for the discussion. "Find a neighborhood with potential for luxury development, identify vulnerable properties, then manipulate HOA regulations to force sales. But it only works if people are isolated, if they don't understand their rights or have the resources to fight back." Emily took rapid notes while Lisa recorded the conversation. The information would be valuable for both the ongoing investigation and the development of new protective regulations. "The thing is," Mike continued, his voice heavy with realization, "what you're building here, this kind of community engagement and education, it's their worst nightmare. Can't intimidate people who understand the system and support each other." Later that afternoon, as James reviewed Mike's documents with Emily, more pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The records showed how Pinnacle had refined their tactics over time, learning from each successful takeover, but they also revealed vulnerabilities in their approach. "Look at this," Emily said, pointing to a pattern in the data. "Every time they encountered organized resistance, they had to back off. Their whole strategy depends on isolating individual homeowners. When communities stand together, their tactics fall apart." James nodded, seeing the implications. "So the best defense isn't just legal protection, it's community engagement. People need to understand both their rights and their responsibilities to each other." The conversation was interrupted by excited voices from the garden. Sarah had been working with some of the workshop participants to install a new rainwater collection system, and they'd just successfully completed the first test. "That's what they didn't understand," James mused, watching the celebration through his office window. "Bradley and his associates saw this place as just another property to acquire. But what we've built here isn't just physical infrastructure, it's social infrastructure. You can't just tear that down with threats and fake violations." Emily smiled, gathering her notes. "Speaking of infrastructure, the prosecutor wants to use your case as a template for other communities. They're calling it the Oak Valley model, combining legal protection, sustainable design, and community engagement to prevent predatory development." The name made James chuckle. Ironic that Bradley's attempts to destroy this place might end up protecting neighborhoods across the country. As evening approached, James stood in his garden, watching the last of the workshop participants leave. The setting sun cast long shadows across the raised beds and water systems he'd designed, but instead of feeling tired, he felt invigorated. What had started as a fight to protect his property had evolved into something far more significant, a blueprint for building resilient communities. Sarah joined him, slipping her hand into his. "Penny for your thoughts?" "Just thinking about infrastructure," he replied with a smile, "and how the strongest kind isn't made of concrete and steel." 2 months after Bradley Thompson's arrest, Oak Valley hosted an unusual neighborhood gathering. Representatives from communities across the state had come to learn about what local media had dubbed the Oak Valley Revolution. The community center, once the site of Bradley's attempted intimidation, was now filled with people eager to understand how to protect and strengthen their own neighborhoods. James stood at the podium, surveying the packed room. Among the faces, he recognized fellow holdouts from other Pinnacle-targeted communities, city planners from neighboring municipalities, and even a few state legislators interested in reforming HOA regulations. What happened here wasn't just about stopping predatory development, James began, his engineer's precision helping him articulate complex ideas clearly. It was about recognizing that true community resilience comes from understanding both the physical and social structures we build together. The presentation that followed wasn't just his story. It was a collaborative effort. Sarah discussed how they'd organized neighborhood support networks. Emily presented legal strategies for documenting and challenging fraudulent HOA actions. Lisa Martinez explained how cities could better protect residents through improved oversight and engagement. But the most powerful moments came when other neighbors shared their experiences. Mrs. Patel described how her initial fear of speaking out had transformed into determination to help others. David Henderson explained how his tech expertise had helped document patterns of harassment. Each story added another layer to the community's collective strength. During the break, James found himself approached by a group of residents from Riverside Heights, one of the communities Pinnacle had successfully taken over the previous year. "We lost everything," an elderly man said, his voice trembling slightly. 30 years in that house, and they forced us out with their fake violations and threats. But maybe... He gestured to the presentations and discussions happening around them. "Maybe it's not too late to rebuild." James introduced the man to Emily, who had been working with prosecutors on strategies for reversing fraudulent property acquisitions. "It won't be easy," she warned, "but with the evidence we've uncovered and the new protective regulations being developed, we have a real chance at restoration." The afternoon sessions focused on practical applications. In the community center's garden, James demonstrated how sustainable design principles could be adapted for different properties and climates. Inside, Sarah and Mrs. Chen led workshops on organizing effective community education programs. "The key," James explained to a group examining his water management system designs, "is understanding that everything is connected. When you help your neighbor improve their property, you strengthen the entire community." That's what Bradley and his associates never understood. They saw division as power, but real strength comes from connection. As the event wound down, Lisa Martinez shared some unexpected news. The City Council had unanimously approved a new set of regulations inspired by Oak Valley's experience. The changes would require greater transparency from HOAs, protect educational and environmental initiatives, and establish clear guidelines for community engagement in development decisions. But the most important change, Lisa announced, is the establishment of a community protection task force, and they've asked Mr. Reeves to serve as a technical advisor. The news caught James by surprise, but as he thought about it, the role made perfect sense. His experience bridging technical expertise with community engagement could help other neighborhoods develop their own resilience. That evening, as the last visitors departed, James and Sarah sat in their garden, reflecting on how much had changed. The raised beds were flourishing, new workshop projects were taking shape, and the sound of children's laughter still echoed from the afternoon's activities. "Remember when you thought retiring meant slowing down?" Sarah teased, squeezing his hand. James chuckled. "I think I'm busier now than when I was designing skyscrapers. But this," he gestured to their thriving property and the connected community beyond, "this feels more important somehow." A text from Emily interrupted their moment. "Got word from the prosecutor. Bradley took a plea deal. He's giving up everything on Pinnacle's operations. More communities coming forward every day." Sarah read the message over his shoulder. "It's not over, is it? There will be more battles, more communities needing help." "No, it's not over," James agreed, already thinking about how to adapt their experiences into resources for others. "But now we know how to fight back. More importantly, we know how to build something better." As night fell over Oak Valley, lights winked on in neighboring houses. Where there had once been isolation and fear, there was now connection and strength. The garden James had fought to protect had grown into something far more significant, a seed of change that was already spreading beyond their neighborhood's boundaries. "You know what's funny?" he said, rising to water the evening's new plantings. "Bradley thought he could break this community by targeting its foundations. Instead, he just helped us discover how strong they really are." Sarah watched her husband tend to the garden they'd defended together, knowing that tomorrow would bring more workshops, more planning sessions, more opportunities to strengthen the bonds they'd built. The battle for Oak Valley was over, but its legacy was just beginning. The impact of Oak Valley's transformation rippled outward in unexpected ways. One morning, about 3 months after the community gathering, James received a call from the State Attorney General's office. The investigation into Pinnacle had uncovered similar operations in multiple states, and they wanted him to testify before a legislative committee on predatory development practices. "Your community's response has become something of a case study," the Assistant Attorney General explained. "We're seeing a pattern where organized communities are significantly more resistant to these takeover attempts. We'd like you to help us understand how to replicate that success." Before James could respond, Sarah appeared in his office doorway holding a newspaper. The headline caught his attention immediately. "Pinnacle Urban Development Group CEO indicted on federal charges." Below was a photo of Bradley Thompson being escorted from the courthouse in handcuffs. "It's not just Bradley anymore," Sarah said, handing him the paper. "The whole operation is unraveling. Mike Donovan's records helped them connect dots across multiple states." The article detailed how Bradley's plea deal had led investigators to Pinnacle's upper management, revealing a sophisticated network of shell companies and fraudulent property schemes. But what really caught James's attention was a sidebar story about communities fighting back using what they called the Oak Valley Protocol. Later that day, during his regular workshop session, James noticed several unfamiliar faces in the crowd. One of them, a woman in her mid-50s, approached him afterward. "I'm Catherine Winters," she introduced herself. "I'm part of the Meadowbrook Restoration Committee. Our neighborhood was one of Pinnacle's first targets 5 years ago. We lost everything, not just our homes, but our whole community." She paused, fighting back tears. "But after reading about what happened here, we've started organizing. We want to rebuild, the right way this time." James led her to his office, where Sarah already had coffee waiting. Catherine spread out maps of her old neighborhood, now partially demolished for a development project that had stalled after Pinnacle's legal troubles began. "The properties are in limbo," she explained. "The development's frozen, the original. Owners are scattered, but there's still a core group of us who want to come back. We just don't know where to start." James studied the maps, his engineer's mind already analyzing possibilities. The first step isn't about the buildings, he said, pulling out his design notebooks. It's about rebuilding the connections between people. The physical infrastructure follows from that. Over the next few hours, they developed a framework for Meadowbrook's restoration. Emily joined them via video call, offering legal insights about reclaiming fraudulently acquired properties. Lisa Martinez provided guidance on navigating city regulations for community redevelopment. This is bigger than just reclaiming properties, Catherine realized, watching the plan take shape. We're talking about fundamentally changing how communities protect themselves. James nodded, thinking about how far they'd come from those first tense confrontations in his driveway. The strongest communities aren't built by developers or HOAs, he said. They're built by people working together, understanding both their rights and their responsibilities to each other. The conversation was interrupted by excited voices from the garden. A group of workshop participants had just completed installing a new vertical growing system, adapting James's designs for limited space applications. The pride in their accomplishment was visible on every face. That's what they could never understand, Sarah observed, watching the celebration. You can't force community through rules and threats. It has to grow naturally, like a garden. As evening approached, Catherine prepared to leave, clutching a thick folder of notes and designs. "You've given us hope," she said, her voice thick, with emotion. "Not just for rebuilding our homes, but for creating something better than what we lost." After she left, James stood in his garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The raised beds were bursting with life, the water systems humming efficiently, and the sound of neighbors chatting drifted over from nearby yards. Everything Bradley Thompson had tried to destroy was not only intact, but thriving. "The Attorney General's office called back," Sarah said, joining him. "They want you to help develop guidelines for community protection legislation. They're calling it the Safe Communities Act." James smiled, remembering how this had all started with a simple attempt to block his driveway. Who would have thought that defending our little garden would lead to all this? "You did," Sarah replied softly. "You saw the bigger picture from the beginning. It was never just about our property. It was about standing up for something worth protecting." As night fell over Oak Valley, James thought about all the communities out there facing similar battles. The work ahead would be challenging, but they'd created something powerful. A blueprint not just for resistance, but for renewal. The garden he'd fought to protect had become a seed of change, sprouting hope in places where it had been lost. Tomorrow would bring more workshops, more planning sessions, more opportunities to strengthen and share what they'd built. But for now, James was content to stand in his garden, holding Sarah's hand, knowing that they'd helped create something that would continue growing long after the sun had set. The morning of James's testimony before the State Legislative Committee arrived with an unexpected development. As he reviewed his notes over breakfast, a news alert flashed across his phone. Pinnacle development scandal expands. Multiple HOA board members arrested across 3 states. "They're calling it Operation Community Shield," Emily explained when she arrived to accompany him to the hearing. "The federal task force is moving simultaneously in multiple jurisdictions." Bradley's testimony opened the floodgates. The legislative chamber was packed when they arrived. Representatives from affected communities filled the gallery, many wearing green ribbons, a symbol that had emerged from Oak Valley's garden workshops to represent community resilience. James recognized faces from their neighborhood gathering, including Catherine Winters and several other Restoration Committee leaders. "We're not just here to talk about what went wrong," James began his testimony, setting aside his prepared notes. "We're here to discuss how communities can protect themselves and how legislation can support those efforts rather than enable predatory practices." For the next hour, James walked the committee through Oak Valley's experience, but with a focus on solutions rather than problems. He explained how transparent governance, community engagement, and sustainable development practices could create resilience against hostile takeover attempts. The problem isn't HOAs themselves, he explained, drawing on his engineering background to make complex systems understandable. It's the vulnerability to manipulation. When we design bridges, we build in redundancies and safety systems. Communities need similar protections. The committee members leaned forward as James presented data from multiple communities, showing how engaged residents and transparent processes had successfully resisted predatory development attempts. His technical expertise, combined with real-world experience, made a compelling case for systematic change. During a break in the testimony, Sarah texted him a photo from Oak Valley. The community center was hosting a garden knowledge exchange, an idea that had grown from his workshops. Residents from neighboring communities were sharing sustainable design practices, legal resources, and organization strategies. "You've started something remarkable," one committee member commented during the questioning period. "But how do we scale this? How do we protect communities that don't have someone with your expertise?" James smiled, thinking of all the people who had contributed to Oak Valley's transformation. "That's exactly why I'm here. The expertise doesn't have to come from one person. It comes from building networks of knowledge and support. My engineering background helped, but our success came from people working together, sharing their different skills and experiences." He proceeded to outline a proposal for a community resource network, a system where experienced communities could mentor others, sharing expertise and support. The idea had emerged from their work with Catherine's group and others seeking to rebuild. "Think of it like a distributed support system," he explained, sketching a diagram on the presentation screen. "Legal experts, technical advisors, community organizers, all connected and available to help communities protect themselves. The legislation we're discussing should facilitate these connections, not just impose regulations." The afternoon session focused on specific policy recommendations. Emily presented legal frameworks for protecting community rights, while Lisa Martinez discussed how cities could better oversee development projects. But the most powerful moments came when residents from affected communities shared their stories. Catherine Winters described Meadowbrook's ongoing restoration efforts, explaining how Oak Valley's model had given them a blueprint for rebuilding. Others spoke about successfully resisting takeover attempts using strategies they'd learned from James's workshops. As the hearing concluded, the committee chair announced the formation of a special task force to draft comprehensive community protection legislation. To James's surprise, they asked him to serve as a technical advisor. "We need people who understand both the engineering and human aspects of community development," the chair explained. "Your experience bridges that gap." Later that evening, back in Oak Valley, James walked through his garden with Sarah. The workshops had evolved into a full-fledged community education program, with classes on everything from sustainable design to local governance. The raised beds were thriving, tended now by a rotating group of volunteers who shared their harvests with neighbors. "Remember when you were worried about retiring?" Sarah teased, watching a group of teenagers working on a new rainwater collection system. "Design about not having enough to do," James chuckled, remembering how different his retirement plans had been. Instead of slowing down, he'd found himself at the center of a growing movement for community empowerment and sustainable development. His phone buzzed with a message from Emily. "Committee's drafting the preliminary bill. They're calling it the Community Resilience Act. Want to review the technical sections?" "The work never ends, does it?" Sarah observed, reading over his shoulder. "No," James agreed. thinking about all the communities still fighting their own battles. But that's the point, isn't it? Real communities are never finished. They keep growing, adapting, getting stronger. As night fell over Oak Valley, lights came on in neighboring houses, each one representing a connection in the network they'd built together. What had started as a simple stand against intimidation had grown into something far more significant, a model for how communities could protect and strengthen themselves. The garden he'd fought to protect had become more than just a symbol of resistance. It was now a seed of change, sprouting hope and resilience in places where they were needed most. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to build and strengthen, but for now, James was content knowing they'd helped create something that would continue growing long after the sun had set. The impact of James's testimony reverberated far beyond the legislative chamber. Within weeks, communities across the state began implementing what they called Oak Valley assessments, comprehensive evaluations of their vulnerabilities to predatory development practices. James found himself fielding calls and emails from neighborhood organizations, city planners, and even international community groups interested in their protection strategies. One morning, as he prepared for another workshop session, Sarah brought him a letter that made him pause. It was from Kevin Walsh, Bradley Thompson's former associate from Apex Compliance Services, writing from federal custody. "I've been thinking a lot about what we tried to destroy," the letter began. "Watching the news about all these communities fighting back, using your methods. It's made me realize how wrong we were. The prosecutors want me to help identify other operations like Pinnacle. I want to do more than that. I want to help communities protect themselves." James shared the letter with Emily during their weekly strategy meeting. She was skeptical but intrigued. His insider knowledge could be valuable, she admitted, especially for communities still dealing with active takeover attempts. But we'd need to be careful about how to use that information. Their discussion was interrupted by Lisa Martinez, who arrived with exciting news from the City Planning Commission. "They've approved the pilot program," she announced, spreading blueprints across James's desk. 5 neighborhoods will be implementing the Oak Valley model as part of their community development plans. They want you to oversee the technical aspects. The blueprints showed diverse communities, each with unique challenges and opportunities. One was a historic district fighting gentrification, another a suburban area dealing with aggressive development pressure. What they shared was a desire to build resilience using the principles James had helped develop. "It's not just about physical infrastructure," James explained to the workshop participants later that day as they reviewed the pilot program plans. "Each community needs to identify its core strengths and vulnerabilities. The technical solutions follow from understanding those relationships." The workshop had grown beyond its original scope, now including residents from neighboring communities eager to learn. Today's session focused on documenting community assets, not just physical properties, but skills, relationships, and cultural resources that could help resist predatory practices. "Think of it like a structural analysis," James continued, drawing on his engineering background. "In building design, we don't just look at individual components, we study how they work together under stress. Communities are the same way. The strongest ones have multiple support systems, redundancies, ways to distribute pressure." Sarah watched from the doorway as participants mapped their community networks, identifying potential weaknesses and opportunities for strengthening connections. What had started as a simple gardening workshop had evolved into a comprehensive program for community empowerment. Later that afternoon, Catherine Winters called with updates from Meadowbrook. Their restoration project was gaining momentum, with former residents returning to help rebuild. They'd adapted James's water management designs to include community gathering spaces, creating what Catherine called resilience hubs throughout the neighborhood. The physical rebuilding is important, she explained, but what's really bringing people back is the sense of purpose, of building something stronger than what we lost. We're not just replacing houses, we're creating a community that can't be torn apart again. As James ended the call, he noticed a group of teenagers working in the garden, carefully documenting their soil testing procedures. They were part of a new youth leadership program, learning both technical skills and community organizing principles. Several had parents who had faced pressure from predatory developers in other neighborhoods. "They get it," Sarah observed, watching the young people work. "They understand that knowledge is protection. Every skill they learn, every connection they make. It's all part of building resilience." The sun was setting when Emily arrived with draft copies of the Community Resilience Act. The legislation had evolved significantly since the hearing, incorporating feedback from multiple communities and experts. James's technical recommendations had been woven throughout, creating a framework for protecting community rights while promoting sustainable development. "It's not perfect," Emily admitted, "but it's a start. More importantly, it gives communities tools to protect themselves while they build stronger networks." As they reviewed the documents, James reflected on how far they'd come from that first confrontation in his driveway. The attempt to intimidate him had instead catalyzed a movement, transforming not just Oak Valley, but communities across the state. His phone buzzed with messages from other neighborhood leaders, sharing updates and seeking advice. The network they'd built was active and growing, each community adding its own knowledge and experience to the collective wisdom. "You know what's remarkable?" Sarah said, bringing him coffee as he responded to the messages. "Bradley thought he could isolate and weaken communities. Instead, he helped create something that's making them stronger than ever." James nodded, thinking about all the people now involved in this growing movement. From his garden workshops to state legislation, from local organizing to national attention, they'd shown that communities could not only resist predatory practices, but build something better in the process. The evening light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the garden beds that had started it all. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new communities seeking help, new opportunities to strengthen and grow. But tonight, James was content knowing that what they'd built would continue flourishing, rooted in the strength of connected communities working together. The first sign that their movement had reached a critical turning point came unexpectedly one Tuesday morning. James was reviewing designs for a new community garden project when Sarah burst into his office, tablet in hand. The national news was running a feature story about predatory development practices, with Oak Valley prominently featured as a model of successful resistance. Communities across the country are adopting what experts now call the Oak Valley Protocol, the reporter explained, as footage showed James working with residents in his garden. This grassroots approach to protecting neighborhood rights has caught the attention of federal lawmakers and urban planning experts alike. Before James could fully process the implications, his phone lit up with a series of urgent messages. Emily had seen the broadcast and was already fielding calls from national media outlets. Lisa Martinez reported that the city planning office was overwhelmed with inquiries about their pilot program. "This changes everything," Emily said when she arrived at their house an hour later, her laptop filled with emails from communities seeking guidance. "We need to think bigger. The demand for help is exponentially larger than what we can handle locally." James stepped out into his garden, now a living laboratory of sustainable community design. Workshop participants were scattered throughout, some testing soil samples, others documenting water flow patterns. The sight gave him an idea. What if we created a training center? he proposed, turning to Emily and Sarah. Not just for gardening or technical skills, but for comprehensive community protection strategies. We could train representatives from other neighborhoods to become local resilience coordinators. The idea took root quickly. Within days, they had drafted a curriculum that combined technical training, legal education, and community organizing principles. The city offered unused space in a community college for the program, recognizing its potential impact on urban development. We need to make this accessible, James insisted during the planning sessions. The whole point is empowering communities to protect themselves. That means sharing knowledge, not hoarding it. Catherine Winters joined the planning team, bringing valuable insights from Meadowbrook's ongoing restoration. Her experience with rebuilding a shattered community added crucial perspectives to the training program. It's not enough to teach people how to resist developers, she explained during a curriculum meeting. They need to understand how to rebuild, trust, how to reconnect fragmented neighborhoods. The technical skills matter, but the human element is just as important. The first training session was scheduled for the following month. They expected perhaps 20 or 30 participants. Instead, over 100 community representatives registered, coming from cities across the country. Many brought stories of their own battles against predatory development, eager to learn and share experiences. James stood before the packed auditorium, feeling the weight of their collective hopes and fears. What we're building here isn't just about protecting property, he began. It's about understanding that true community resilience comes from connection, from sharing knowledge and resources, from standing together when forces try to divide us. The 3-day training program was intense. Participants learned about sustainable design principles, legal rights, documentation strategies, and community organizing techniques. But the most valuable moments came during the informal exchanges, as people shared their experiences and began forming support networks. This is what they fear most, Sarah observed, watching participants exchange contact information and plan future collaborations. Not just communities resisting, but communities connecting, learning from each other, building something stronger than what they're trying to tear down. On the final day, as participants presented their action plans for their home communities, James received an unexpected message. The federal task force investigating Pinnacle wanted his input on proposed national guidelines for community protection. They were particularly interested in how technical standards could be integrated with social resilience strategies. They're starting to understand, Emily said, reviewing the request. Real change has to come from both directions. Top-down, policy protection, and bottom-up community empowerment. As the training session concluded, participants gathered in James's garden for a final demonstration of integrated community design. The scene was powerful. People from different backgrounds and regions united in their commitment to protecting and strengthening their communities. This is just the beginning, James told them, standing among the raised beds that had sparked this movement. What you've learned here isn't meant to stay here. Take it back, adapt it, improve it, share it. The strongest communities are the ones that help others grow. That evening, after the participants had departed, James and Sarah sat in their garden, reflecting on how far things had come. The national attention brought new challenges and responsibilities, but it also validated their approach to community protection. Remember when all this was just about keeping our garden, Sarah mused, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues. James smiled, thinking about all the communities now implementing their strategies, all the networks forming, all the people standing up to protect their neighborhoods. The garden was never just about plants, he replied. It was about growing something stronger than what they tried to destroy. His phone buzzed, with messages from training participants already starting to implement what they'd learned. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more communities seeking help, more opportunities to strengthen and expand their network. But tonight, sitting in the garden where it all began, James felt confident that what they'd planted would continue to grow and flourish, reaching far beyond the boundaries of Oak Valley. The momentum building around their community protection movement faced its first major test sooner than anyone expected. One morning, about 2 weeks after the training program concluded, James received an urgent call from a participant named Marcus Rodriguez from a neighborhood in the southwest. "They're moving faster than we anticipated," Marcus explained, his voice tense. "The developers started blocking driveways this morning, just like they did in Oak Valley. But they're targeting multiple properties simultaneously. We've implemented the documentation protocols you taught us, but we need guidance on coordinating our response." James immediately initiated a video conference, bringing in Emily, Catherine, and several other key members of their network. On screen, they could see the situation unfolding in Marcus's neighborhood. Trucks strategically positioned, residents gathering in confusion, and what appeared to be private security personnel monitoring the scene. "They're using our playbook against us," Emily observed, noting how the developers had studied Oak Valley's experience and adapted their tactics. "They're trying to overwhelm the community's ability to respond cohesively." But Marcus and his neighbors had something Pinnacle hadn't counted on: preparation and connection. Within hours, they had activated their community response network, documenting every interaction, coordinating legal observers, and implementing the emergency communication system they developed during the training. "Remember what we discussed," James advised during a strategy session with Marcus's core team. "Their power comes from creating isolation and confusion. Your strength comes from connection and clarity. Show them what an organized community looks like." The response was remarkable. Residents who had completed the Oak Valley training program became neighborhood coordinators, managing documentation teams and support networks. Local media, briefed on the situation using templates developed in their workshops, provided balanced coverage that highlighted the community's professional response. "They expected chaos," Marcus reported later that evening. "Instead, they found a unified community that knew exactly how to protect itself. The look on their faces when our legal team showed up with comprehensive documentation of their tactics, it was priceless." The developers withdrew their trucks by nightfall, but James knew this was just the opening move in a larger battle. Similar reports began coming in from other communities where training participants had identified potential takeover attempts. "We need to scale up faster," Emily insisted during an emergency strategy meeting in James's kitchen. "These developers are adapting their tactics. We need to help communities stay ahead of them." The solution came from an unexpected source. Catherine Winters, who had been quietly building a network of restored communities, proposed creating regional support hubs. Each hub would serve as a rapid response center, providing resources and expertise to communities under threat. "Think of it like a mutual aid network," she explained, spreading a map across James's table. "When one community faces pressure, others in the network can provide immediate support. Legal observers, documentation teams, media coordinators. We've already seen how effective this can be." The idea resonated with James's engineering mindset. "It's about creating redundancy in the support system," he noted, sketching a diagram. "No community should have to stand alone." They spent the next few days developing protocols for the regional hubs, incorporating lessons learned from Marcus's successful defense and other recent experiences. Sarah coordinated with their training program graduates to identify potential hub locations and leadership teams. Meanwhile, the situation in Marcus's neighborhood had attracted national attention. News outlets picked up the story, not just of the attempted takeover, but of the community's organized and effective response. The contrast with traditional narratives of helpless neighborhoods facing powerful developers was striking. "This is changing the conversation," Lisa Martinez observed during a briefing with city officials. Communities aren't just victims anymore. They're showing how preparation and coordination can protect neighborhood rights. The federal task force investigating predatory development practices took notice. They requested detailed documentation of Marcus's community response, seeing it as a potential model for national guidelines on community protection. Back in Oak Valley, James's garden continued to serve as both symbol and practical demonstration of community resilience. New workshop participants arrived daily, eager to learn from their experience. But now, instead of just learning about sustainable design and community organizing, they were studying real-world examples of successful resistance. "Look at what you started," Sarah said one evening, watching a group of visiting community leaders tour their garden. "Every person here represents a neighborhood learning to protect itself." James nodded, thinking about how their movement had evolved. What began as a personal stand against intimidation had grown into a nationwide network of communities supporting each other. The developers had tried to use Oak Valley's experience as a blueprint for more efficient takeovers, but instead they'd helped create a more effective model of community resistance. His phone buzzed with updates from Marcus. They're successful. Defense had inspired neighboring communities to implement similar protection strategies. The regional hub concept was already proving its worth, with support teams helping document and resist development pressure across multiple neighborhoods. "They thought they could adapt faster than we could," James mused, reading the updates. "But they didn't understand what they were really dealing with. You can't outmaneuver a network of connected communities who know how to protect themselves." As night fell over his garden, James reflected on how much had changed since that first confrontation in his driveway. The movement they'd built wasn't just about resistance anymore. It was about transformation, about communities discovering their collective power and learning to use it effectively. The ripple effects of Marcus's successful community defense reached further than anyone anticipated. James awoke one morning to find his inbox flooded with messages from international community organizations. The Oak Valley Protocol had caught the attention of neighborhoods facing similar challenges across the globe. "We're getting requests for training materials in multiple languages," Emily reported during their morning strategy session. "Urban communities in South America and Asia are particularly interested in our rapid response network model." The immediate challenge was adapting their approach to different legal and cultural contexts while maintaining its core effectiveness. James spent long hours working with international urban planning experts, translating technical specifications and community organizing principles into frameworks that could be locally customized. The fundamental principles remain the same, he explained during a virtual workshop with community leaders from 3 continents. Document everything, maintain connection, build redundancy into your support systems. The specific implementations may vary, but the underlying structure is universal. Sarah had taken charge of coordinating these international exchanges, working to ensure that knowledge flowed in both directions. "Every community that joins our network brings new insights," she noted. "We're learning as much from them as they are from us." One particular success story came from a neighborhood in Southeast Asia, where residents had adapted Oak Valley's water management system into a community-wide infrastructure project. Their innovations in combining traditional local practices with modern sustainable design caught James's attention. "This is exactly what we hoped for," he told the project leaders during a video call. "You've taken the basic framework and improved it, made it more resilient by incorporating local knowledge." The federal task force investigating predatory development had also evolved their approach, recognizing that community protection required more than just regulatory oversight. They began incorporating successful local resistance strategies into their enforcement guidelines. We're seeing a fundamental shift in how these cases are handled, Emily explained during a briefing. Instead of just pursuing developers after the fact, authorities are actively working to prevent community disruption. Your engineering approach to social infrastructure made the difference. They finally understand that prevention is more effective than remedy. Back in Oak Valley, the garden continued to evolve. The original workshop space had expanded into a comprehensive training center, with areas dedicated to different aspects of community protection. New raised beds demonstrated innovative design principles learned from international partners, while the water management system showcased improvements suggested by communities around the world. Lisa Martinez brought news that the city was implementing similar training centers in other neighborhoods, creating a network of local resource hubs. The developers can't keep up, she reported. Every time they target a community, they find an organized resistance backed by regional support networks. The transformation wasn't just in physical infrastructure or organizational systems. James noticed a fundamental change in how communities viewed themselves. Where there had once been isolation and vulnerability, there was now connection and confidence. One evening, as he reviewed plans for the next international training session, James received an unexpected message. It was from Kevin Walsh, the former Apex compliance officer, who was now working with authorities to prevent predatory development practices. "I've been studying the communities that successfully resisted Pinnacle," Kevin wrote. "What you've built isn't just a defense system, it's a new model of community development. The old approach of divide and conquer doesn't work against connected neighborhoods that understand their own strength." Sarah found James in the garden later that night, standing among the raised beds that had started it all. "Thinking about how far we've come?" she asked, joining him. "Thinking about how far we still have to go," he replied, showing her messages from communities just beginning to implement their protection strategies, but also about how much stronger we are together than anyone tried to make us believe. The garden lights cast soft shadows across the beds, where tomorrow's workshop participants would learn not just about sustainable design, but about the power of connected communities. What had begun as one neighborhood stand against intimidation had grown into a global movement for community protection and empowerment. James's phone buzzed with updates from regional hubs, each message representing another community learning to stand strong. The developers had tried to break them apart, but instead they'd helped create something unbreakable. A network of communities supporting each other, growing stronger together. The true strength of the network they'd built was tested on a scale no one had anticipated. A massive data leak from a major development consortium revealed coordinated plans to target dozens of communities simultaneously across multiple states. The documents showed how they'd studied both Oak Valley's resistance and Marcus's successful defense, planning to overwhelm support networks with concurrent attacks. "They think they can overload the system," Emily said during an emergency strategy session in James's kitchen. "Hit too many places at once for our regional hubs to handle." But what the developers hadn't understood was how their network had evolved. Within hours of the leak becoming public, their rapid response system mobilized. Communities that had completed their training program activated predetermined protocols, documenting everything and coordinating their responses through the regional support hubs. James found himself at the center of a massive coordination effort, his engineering background proving crucial in managing the complex flow of resources and information. The garden workshop space transformed into an impromptu command center, with screens showing real-time updates from targeted communities. "They're trying the same tactics everywhere," Sarah observed, tracking the patterns. "Blocked access, fraudulent violations, coordinated intimidation. But look at the responses. Each community under threat had implemented their protection strategies differently, adapting the Oak Valley Protocol to their specific circumstances. Some focused on legal documentation, others on media engagement, but all maintained constant communication through their regional hubs. This is what resilience looks like, James explained to a group of reporters covering the coordinated resistance. Not just individual communities standing strong, but a network of neighborhoods supporting each other, sharing resources and expertise. The developers' strategy began to falter as they encountered organized resistance at every turn. Their attempts to isolate communities were met with immediate support from neighboring areas. Documentation teams captured every interaction, legal observers monitored every confrontation, and media coverage highlighted the community's professional responses. Lisa Martinez arrived with news from the City Planning Commission. Other municipalities are reaching out for guidance, she reported. They're seeing how effective coordinated community protection can be. The developers aren't just facing resistance, they're facing a fundamental change in how neighborhoods defend themselves. The federal task force investigating predatory development practices moved quickly, using the leaked documents and community documentation to build cases against multiple companies. But more importantly, they began implementing new protocols based on successful community defense strategies. Your network isn't just resisting development pressure, one investigator told James. You're changing how we think about community protection at a systemic level. Catherine Winter's coordinated support efforts through the Restored Communities Network, demonstrating how neighborhoods that had already faced and overcome similar challenges could guide others through the process. The knowledge sharing went both ways, with each community adding new insights to their collective understanding. International partners also joined the response, providing additional resources and perspective. The global network they'd built proved its worth as communities around the world shared strategies and support. "Look at what they accidentally created," Sarah said one evening, watching updates flow in from successful defense efforts across a country. They thought they could break communities apart, but they ended up helping build something unbreakable. James nodded, thinking about how far they'd come from that first confrontation in his driveway. The garden where it all started had grown into something far more significant, a symbol of how communities could protect and strengthen themselves through connection and cooperation. His phone buzzed with more updates. Another attempted takeover, thwarted, another community standing strong with support from their neighbors. The developers had tried to overwhelm their network, but instead they'd helped demonstrate its resilience. They never understood what they were really fighting, he mused, watching workshop participants prepare for the next day's training session. You can't defeat communities that know how to stand together. As night fell over Oak Valley, James stood in his garden, reflecting on the transformation they'd witnessed. What began as one neighborhood's resistance had grown into a movement that was changing how communities protected themselves worldwide. The developers had tried to use their experience as a blueprint for more efficient takeovers, but instead they'd helped create a more powerful model of collective defense. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new communities needing support, new opportunities to strengthen their network. But tonight, watching the lights come on in houses throughout the neighborhood, James knew they'd built something that would continue growing and evolving long after this battle was won. The aftermath of the coordinated defense against multiple developer attacks brought unexpected attention from an influential source. The United Nations Urban Development Program requested a comprehensive study of the Oak Valley Protocol and its global implementation. This isn't just about protecting individual neighborhoods anymore, Emily explained during a strategy session. They're looking at our model as a potential framework for sustainable urban development worldwide. James spent weeks compiling documentation, working with communities from different countries to demonstrate how the protocol could adapt to various cultural and legal contexts. His engineering precision proved valuable in translating local successes into replicable frameworks. The garden had evolved into an international demonstration site with new sections showcasing innovations from partner communities around the world. Visiting delegations studied not just the technical aspects of sustainable design, but the social infrastructure that made it all work. The physical systems matter, James explained to a group of UN observers, but the real innovation is in how communities connect and support each other. Technical solutions only work when they're rooted in strong social networks. Sarah coordinated with regional hubs to document their rapid response capabilities. The recent coordinated defense had provided valuable data on how effectively communities could mobilize resources and support each other under pressure. Look at these patterns, she showed James, displaying maps of resource sharing during the crisis. Every time developers targeted one area, neighboring communities immediately activated their support networks. The response times kept improving. As they learned from each experience, Lisa Martinez brought updates from other cities implementing similar programs. The developers aren't just facing organized resistance anymore, she reported. They're running into communities that know how to protect themselves before the pressure even starts. The federal task force had expanded its focus, working with international law enforcement to track global patterns of predatory development. James's technical analysis helped identify common tactics and vulnerabilities, leading to more effective prevention strategies. One morning, as James reviewed plans for the next phase of their training program, he received a message from Marcus Rodriguez. The southwestern community that had successfully defended itself months ago was now helping others implement protection strategies. "Your garden started something bigger than any of us imagined," Marcus wrote. "We're not just saving neighborhoods anymore. We're changing how communities think about themselves and their power to resist exploitation." The garden workshops had evolved into a comprehensive education center, training community leaders in everything from sustainable design to rapid response coordination. Each session brought new insights and innovations as participants shared their experiences and adaptations. "Remember when we thought this was just about blocking a driveway?" Sarah mused, watching a group of international participants collaborate on new protection strategies. "Now look at what it's become." James nodded, thinking about how their movement had grown. The developers' attempted overwhelming attack had backfired spectacularly, demonstrating the strength of connected communities and inspiring others to join their network. His phone buzzed constantly with updates from regional hubs, each message representing another community learning to stand strong. What had started in his garden had grown into a global movement for community protection and empowerment. The evening light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the garden. Beds that had sparked this transformation, tomorrow would bring new challenges, new communities seeking help, new opportunities to strengthen their network. But tonight, watching the international group of workshop participants share stories and strategies, James knew they'd built something that would continue growing and evolving long after their initial victory. "They tried to break us apart," he said to Sarah, observing the collaborative energy around them. "But instead, they helped us discover how strong we really are together." The garden lights came on automatically as dusk settled, illuminating the living laboratory of community resilience they'd created. Each bed, each water system, each careful design element told a story of resistance and renewal, of communities learning to protect and strengthen themselves through connection and cooperation. VEE Recognition of the Oak Valley Protocol as a global model for community protection brought new challenges and opportunities. As James prepared for an upcoming UN presentation, he received an unexpected message that would test their network in ways they hadn't imagined. "We've identified a pattern of climate-related displacement being used to force community relocations," Emily reported, spreading satellite images across James's desk. "Developers are exploiting natural disasters to pressure vulnerable neighborhoods into selling." The evidence was clear. In areas affected by floods, fires, or storms, certain development companies were moving quickly to acquire damaged properties, often using the same tactics they'd seen from Pinnacle, but masked by the chaos of disaster recovery. "This is where our network can really prove its worth," James realized, his engineering mind already analyzing potential solutions. "We're not just protecting communities from direct development pressure anymore, we're helping them become resilient against multiple threats." Working with their international partners, they began developing rapid response protocols specifically for disaster-affected communities. Sarah coordinated with regional hubs to create emergency resource-sharing networks, while Catherine Winters contributed insights from her experience rebuilding shattered neighborhoods. The garden became a testing ground for new resilience strategies. James and his team designed modular systems that could be quickly implemented in crisis situations, combining sustainable infrastructure with community protection measures. "It's all connected," he explained during an emergency planning session. "The same principles that help communities resist predatory development can help them survive and recover from natural disasters. It's about building networks of mutual support and understanding how to use them effectively." Lisa Martinez brought city planners to study their adaptable defense systems. "We're looking at implementing these protocols citywide," she announced. "Not just for development pressure, but for any situation where communities need to protect and support each other." The federal task force expanded its investigation to include disaster-related property acquisition schemes. James's technical analysis helped identify patterns that might have gone unnoticed, subtle connections between natural disasters and subsequent development pressures. One morning, as workshop participants practiced rapid response scenarios, James received an urgent call from a coastal community facing both rising sea levels and aggressive development pressure. "They're using the environmental threats to justify forced relocations," the community leader explained. "But we don't want to abandon our neighborhood. We want to adapt and protect it." James mobilized their network immediately. Within days, teams of technical experts, legal advisors, and community organizers were on the ground, helping residents develop comprehensive protection strategies that addressed both immediate development pressure and long-term environmental challenges. "This is the future of community resilience," he told Sarah as they coordinated support efforts. "It's not enough to just resist developers anymore. We need to help communities become strong enough to face any challenge." The garden continued to evolve, incorporating new designs that demonstrated how neighborhoods could adapt to environmental changes while maintaining their social fabric. Each innovation was documented and shared through their global network, allowing communities worldwide to learn and adapt the strategies to their own situations. "Look what they helped create," Sarah said one evening, watching international participants collaborate on new protection protocols. "They thought they could use natural disasters to break communities apart. Instead, they've helped us build something even stronger." James nodded, thinking about how their movement had grown, from protecting single neighborhoods to strengthening entire networks of communities against multiple threats. His phone buzzed constantly with updates from regional hubs, each message representing another neighborhood learning not just to resist, but to adapt and thrive. The evening light filtered through newly installed solar panels that powered their emergency response systems, Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new communities seeking help, new threats to face together. But tonight, watching the diverse group of workshop participants share knowledge and strategies, James knew they'd built something that would continue evolving to meet whatever challenges lay ahead. They never understood what community really means, he said, surveying the garden that had started it all. It's not just about protecting what we have. It's about growing stronger together, no matter what comes our way. The garden lights came on, illuminating the living laboratory of resilience they'd created. Each element, from the water management systems to the emergency response protocols, told a story of communities learning to protect and strengthen themselves through connection, adaptation, and unwavering support for each other. 1 year after the first attempted blockade of his driveway, James stood in his garden, addressing a different kind of gathering. Representatives from communities worldwide had come to Oak Valley to celebrate the official launch of the global Community Resilience Network, a formalized version of the support system they'd built. What began here wasn't just about resisting development pressure, he told the assembled crowd. It was about discovering our collective strength, about learning that true resilience comes from connection and mutual support. The garden had transformed into an international center for community protection and sustainable development. New sections showcased innovations from partner communities around the world, while the original raised beds remained as a reminder of where it all started. Sarah coordinated with regional hubs, now numbering in the hundreds, as they implemented standardized protection protocols while maintaining local adaptability. The network had proven its effectiveness, not just against predatory development, but in helping communities face various challenges together. Emily brought the final update on the legal front. Bradley Thompson and the Pinnacle executives had received their sentences. More importantly, the precedents established through their case had led to sweeping reforms in development regulations and community protection laws. But the real victory isn't in the courtroom, Emily noted. It's in how communities have learned to protect themselves and each other. They can't intimidate neighborhoods that know their own strength. Lisa Martinez shared news from the City Planning Commission. The Oak Valley Protocol was being incorporated into municipal development guidelines across the country. Communities would now have built-in protections and support systems from the start. As evening approached, James walked through the garden with Sarah, reflecting on their journey. The workshop space buzzed with activity as participants from different continents shared strategies and experiences. What had started as one neighborhood stand against intimidation had grown into a global movement for community empowerment. Remember, when they thought blocking our driveway would force us to give in, Sarah asked, watching the diverse group of community leaders collaborate on new protection strategies. James nodded, thinking about how their response to that simple act of intimidation had sparked such profound change. His phone continued to buzz with updates from regional hubs, each message representing another community learning to stand strong. The garden lights came on automatically, illuminating the living testament to community resilience they'd created. Each element, from the water systems to the emergency response protocols, told a story of neighborhoods learning to protect and strengthen themselves through connection and cooperation. They tried to break us apart, James said, watching the next generation of community leaders practice the skills they'd need to protect their own neighborhoods. Instead, they helped us build something unbreakable. As night fell over Oak Valley, the lights in neighboring houses winked on, each one representing a connection in the network they'd built together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new communities seeking help, new opportunities to grow stronger. But tonight, standing in the garden where it all began, James knew they'd created something that would continue flourishing long after the sun had set. The legacy of their resistance wasn't just in the physical infrastructure or legal precedents. It was in the countless communities that had learned to stand together, support each other, and build something stronger than any force that tried to tear them apart. "Ready for tomorrow's workshop?" Sarah asked. Knowing the answer, James smiled, thinking of all the communities yet to join their network, all the neighborhoods yet to discover their collective strength. "Always," he replied. "There's still so much more to grow." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.